Hi, I'm Alan Drew, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the director of the Literary Festival, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a nice turnout, so it's nice to see you all here. Hopefully, we'll see if we can get a few more seats, and there's a few more in here if you want to fill in, but I think there's plenty of room for people to sit. Again, thanks for coming, and this is the final reading of the season, and we're very excited to have Adelle Waldman here tonight. Before I introduce Mary Lister and Mary Finnegan, who will give the formal introductions, I need to thank a few people that make this festival happen. Our co-sponsors, in particular, the English department, faculty and staff. Without the faculty and staff, this thing wouldn't happen. Faculty and staff sort of teach a lot of the work that we showcase here, and it's nice to see the students come in, so thank you. College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Flavi Library did such a great job of putting these events on here in Speaker's Corner. Gender and Women's Studies, Irish Studies, the Honors Program, Africana Studies, and the Writing Center. And just a personal thanks to Lisa Sewell, with a colleague with whom I teach the Literary Festival course, who's great to teach with, and it's always fun to do this with her. And Susan Peterson is in the back, who got some fantastic brownies. These are better than the normal brownies in the back. And if you notice, they have owls on the top of them, right? No. I didn't know this was going to happen. So there's some food back there and brownies, so go ahead and get some. And Susan is the graduate assistant who just fixes all my mistakes, so without her, this thing would fall apart. So Adele's going to read for a little while, and then she's agreed to take some questions, so please get your questions ready. And there's book signing afterwards. There are books in the back, so please go ahead and buy one and get your book signed. What else? So thanks again for coming out, and I'm going to turn it over to Mary and Mary.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. So again, everybody, welcome to Villanova's Literary Festival. We are so happy to have you here, and we're really happy to have Adelle Waldman here. The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P. is Adelle Waldman's debut novel, which captures the voice of a hopelessly self-absorbed 30-something writer living in New York City. The book was published in July of last year and has been called one of the year's best books by The New Yorker, The Economist, NPR, and The Guardian, among many others. A journalist by trade, Waldman has written for the New York Times Book Review, the Wall Street Journal, The New Republic, and Slate. She was educated at Brown University, and she has a passion for Jane Austen novels and likens the main character, Nate Piven, to Austen's own commitment-wary suitor, Henry Crawford, in Mansfield Park. In fact, Waldman has been called a younger Edith Wharton by The New Yorker. This is a perfect book to curl up with on a lazy afternoon and fall into the racing thoughts of Nathaniel P. An enjoyable read, Waldman almost made me forget how confusing men like Nate really are. Throughout this novel, she has encouraged honest conversation on gender dynamics and relationships, and I was excited to find out that Waldman will be releasing a short story told from the perspective of Orit, Nathaniel P.'s female best friend and an honest observer of his love affairs. William Dershowitz accurately said, novelist Adelle Waldman does a very tricky thing. She succeeds in crossing the gender line, imagining the world from behind the eyes of a male character both sympathetically and unsentimentally. As Waldman said in class today, Nate is your garden variety, somewhat less charming, window into the brain of any development-arrested man in your life.
Good evening, everyone. I'm the second Mary of 4 in this class. In her debut novel, The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P., Adelle Waldman accomplishes a feat that I'll never hope to come close to: understanding the male mind. And what a terrifying mind this is. I'll be the first to admit that I am more than a little scared. Waldman's novel awakens a sort of inner scrutiny within the reader that only the excruciating experience of dating can inspire. She effortlessly escorts us into this world, set in literary Brooklyn, revealing to us its deepest intimacies, whether they are found between the lines of a 6-figure book advance or the sheets of Nate Piven's bed. I have to admit The name Nate used to be a top competitor on my list of baby names. That is until I met Nathaniel P. Young, obnoxiously articulate, and mildly attractive. He's starting to grow a bit of a belly. Nathaniel P. is sure to infuriate every woman, living or dead, within a 100-mile radius. The reader's sky-high level of infuriation is a testament to Waldman's ability to enter the mind of the modern single male. Jane Austen might compare Nate to a veritable Mr. Darcy, pre-transformation by Elizabeth, that is. Nate's still in the process of ego downsizing. But never fear, ladies, he's getting there. It's just a work in progress. Nathaniel Piven is not a bad man. He's just not a particularly good man either, especially if you're dating him. As we witness many women try to, and fail to. Exhausted by women's obsession with relationships and feelings, Nate is determined to devote the majority of his life to higher pursuits, aka his literary career. Which explains, of course, why such a rational man as himself jumps from one relationship to the next in the record timing of little more than a week. Waldman has been aptly described by Shea Simon of the Boston Globe as this generation's Jane Austen, as she skewers the mating wars of today's aristocrats, the young literary elite of Brooklyn, New York, in her funny and at times painfully acute debut novel. I say, Waldman is this generation's Austen without the Victorian censorship. Whatever you do, don't read this book out loud to your mother. It'll spoil all of the fun. And without further ado, it is with great pleasure that I introduce the woman who makes us ask all of the juicy questions, the lovely, literary Adelle Waldman.
Okay, I'm kind of rendered speechless. Those were so fun and flattering and such excellent, charming introductions. Wow, too funny. And I have to admit, speaking of reading the book aloud to one's mother, you will probably see me blush a little bit when I start my reading at certain parts that are a little bit racy. And I'm used to doing readings and I'm used to the racy parts, but somehow the fact that this is a library and it's brightly lit. Anyway, don't panic when I sort of blush and giggle. But yeah, it's no. Anyway, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks to Alan Drew for having me, and to Lisa Sewell and all the students today in the literary festival class. It's been so much fun to be here. I am going to read from my book. Now, I'm going to read a part that is backstory. So as you've heard, the book is about this 30-something writer in Brooklyn. But the part I like to read is about Nate's formative years in high school and college. And this is the second chapter of the book. All you need to know about what's happened before now is that in the first chapter, Nate has run into an ex-girlfriend of his on the streets of New York, and the encounter didn't go very well. It ended with her calling him an asshole and storming off. So this is chapter 2. Oh, one other thing. You see me playing with my phone. I'm not checking email. I'm just checking the time. So that's that. Okay. Nate had not always been the kind. And actually, if you can't hear in the back, do let me know. Nate had not always been the kind of guy women call an asshole. Only recently had he been popular enough to inspire such ill will. Growing up, he had been considered nice. He was also a wonderkind of advanced placement classes, a star debater, and a fledgling songwriter whose extra credit homage to Madonna for Math Appreciation Week, like a cosine, solved for the very first time, had, unfortunately, been broadcast to the entire upper school. Despite playing on the varsity soccer and baseball teams since 10th grade, granted his was a Jewish day school, he never quite achieved the reputation of an athlete. He didn't repel girls exactly. They sought him out for help with bio or calculus, even for advice about their personal problems. They flirted with him when they wanted an ego boost, and then they told him about their crushes on Todd or Mike or Scott. Nate wasn't much to look at back then. Dark-haired and skinny, he had a pale, sunken chest that he felt made him look cowardly, as if he were perpetually shrinking back. Though he wasn't painfully short, he wasn't tall either. His hands, eyebrows, nose, and Adam's apple appeared to have been intended for a much larger person. This caused him to hold out hope, even as high school progressed, that he might spring up another couple inches into the 5-foot double digits. In the meantime, though, these attributes didn't exactly add to his stock of personal charms. Todd and Mike and Scott were Nate's soccer and baseball teammates. Scott was the most popular guy in their class. He was tall and broad-shouldered and had that combination of crudeness and confidence that rendered intelligence not only irrelevant, but slightly ridiculous. A peculiar, if not entirely unamusing talent, like the ability to ride a unicycle. Todd and Mike and Scott were not exactly Nate's friends, at least not on terms of equality. But they thought he was funny. They also relied on him for help with calculus. Todd and Mike did anyway. Scott never made it past trigonometry. Nate went to their parties, Nate got drunk, jokes were made about how funny it was that Nate, bard of the math department, with a 4.0 GPA, was drunk. Meanwhile, Nate pined for girls like Amy Perelman, the stacked blonde siren of their class, whose bashfully averted eyes and modest smile were nicely offset by her clingy sweaters and ass-hugging jeans. Naturally, Amy went out with Scott, although one day she confided to Nate that she was worried about their future. I mean, what will become of him? Like if his dad's stores, liquidated designer goods, don't keep doing well? My dad says they're, over-leveraged. But Scott can barely read. I mean, he can read, just not, whole books. But I can't see him doing well in college and getting a regular job. It just wouldn't be him, you know? In retrospect, it wasn't surprising that Amy Perelman, who was not actually stupid but only affected stupidity in her speech, because that was the fashion, eventually ditched Scott and got an MBA from Wharton. At the time, however, Nate had, somewhat to his own surprise, come to Scott's defense. He's a good guy, though, and he really likes you. Amy looked thoughtful, but not quite convinced. I guess. Nate did have one admirer during high school. Frizzy-haired Michelle Goldstein. It wasn't that Michelle wasn't pretty. He'd been interested in girls who looked worse, anyway. But there was something painfully self-conscious about her. Well, it should have been refreshing to see someone at their school engrossed in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Michelle's embrace of culture seemed a bit affected. She had an inexplicable fondness for the phrase pas de deux, which Nate had once, frighteningly enough, overheard her use in reference to her relationship with him. Still, at moments, Nate felt real affection for Michelle. One spring night, it must have been after a school play or concert, they sat together for hours on a bench outside the upper school, gazing down a grassy hill towards the dark expanse of the athletic fields. Michelle spoke intelligently, touchingly, about the music she liked. Moody female singer-songwriters with socially progressive lyrics. And of her intention to live in New York one day, to go off into the Strand. A huge used bookstore downtown, she had to explain. Nate wasn't sure if he'd even been to a used bookstore. There weren't any in their suburb, he didn't think. You should go to New York sometime, Michelle said. I've been, Nate said. From his family's weekend in New York, Nate had photos taken by his dad of him and his mother huddled together on the observation deck of the Empire State Building. They wore newly purchased ponchos and smiled wanly while a cold drizzle fell on their heads. We didn't go any place like that, Nate said. Michelle smiled sympathetically. In the light that spilled over from the parking lot, Nate thought Michelle's freckles and straw-colored hair were cute. He nearly reached out across the bench and touched her hand or her thigh. It wasn't even about sex. Nate's life had been somewhat short on friendship, real friendship, distinct from the sort of conditional alliance he had with Scott and company. Sitting on the bench with Michelle, Nate felt as if the two of them shared something, some nebulous, slightly melancholic sensitivity that made them different from their classmates. But at school on Monday, Michelle seemed to have reverted back to her other self. I can't believe you got an A on that test, she said after calculus. What a coup d'etat. She gave a little wave as she walked away. Ciao, cherie. Coup, Nate wanted to shout. You mean just plain coup. Yet he and Michelle were constantly lumped together and treated as a couple. Scott repeatedly asked him if her cooter smelled like mothballs because of all the vintage clothes she wore. Her Her ambiguous social status, neither cool nor uncool, apparently made her his female equivalent. They even went to senior prom together. Nate had been working up the nerve to ask a pretty sophomore, and he felt both resentment and relief when Michelle was asking him foreclosed that possibility. On prom night, he even thought Michelle might have been willing to have sex, but he didn't really try. Oh, they made out. Well, more than made out, actually. He had a brief opportunity to assess Scott's hypothesis vis-a-vis the bouquet of her female parts. But Nate didn't push, because at that particular moment in his life, he didn't want to get entangled with a girl who was slightly repulsive to him. Nor could he imagine sleeping with Michelle and then blowing her off the way that Todd or Mike might have, although not Scott, who for all his crudity was sensitive and unwavering in his devotion to Amy. But there was something that rubbed Nate wrong about Todd and Mike's attitude toward girls, their implicit belief that whatever befell a foolish or unattractive one was her just deserts. Empathy they reserved for the best-looking girls. Amy's most minor setbacks, a B+ or a mild cold, elicited coups of grave concern. Besides, by prom, Nate had largely begun to pin his erotic hopes on college, where he imagined even girls who looked like Amy Perelman would be smart, and more important, mature, a word he had lately begun to interpret as willing to have sex with him. If he were to list the biggest disappointments of his life, freshman year of college would be near the top, right behind the realization, much later, that even something as sublime as a blowjob could be boring, even slightly unpleasant, under the wrong circumstances, or performed inexpertly. Had he been an urchin rescued from the back alley where he'd foraged for food in dumpsters and solved millennia-old math problems on the inside of torn cereal boxes, Nate couldn't have been more naive, more uneducated in the social mores of a place like Harvard. And if he'd been a homeless autodidact, at least he would have reaped the social benefit of being exotic. What had seemed normal back home screamed Mall of America, middle management, and mediocrity on a campus where the tone had been set long ago by Puritans with names like Lowell, Dunster, and Cabot. Todd and Mike and Scott, with their gelled hair fanning up from their foreheads and their polo shirts and BMWs, shrank in size. The kids who seemed to belong at Harvard, the ones who seemed at ease, chatting breezily in the yard, greeting old friends, and throwing their heads back in laughter, they drove beat-up Volvos, ordered clothing from catalogs, an activity Nate had previously associated with isolated prairie farms and early Montgomery Ward circulars. And in a flat English, shorn of all regional accent, reeled off the names of places he had never heard of. Yeah, I've been to Islesboro. My uncle has a house there. We go to Blue Hill every summer. Before arriving in Cambridge, Nate had mentally prepared for Park Avenue, for country clubs, yachts, caviar, for the heedless extravagance of Tom and Daisy Buchanan. But Maine caught him by surprise. Nate was used to summer locales that advertised themselves as such in their names. Long Beach Island, Ocean City. His new classmates, they weren't playboys or debutantes. They didn't wear blazers. The girls weren't named Muffy or Binky. A fair number had even gone to public schools, albeit largely a specific breed of elite public school. They were thin, ponytailed girls who wore no makeup and slouching guys in t-shirts and khaki shorts. They spoke of kayaking and hiking as the ne plus ultra amusements of their young lives. Nate, who had done those things at summer camp, hadn't accorded them any special significance beyond that of the other required activities, such as singing around the campfire and making finger puppets from strips of felt. When Amy Perelman's family had gone to Vail for spring break, everyone at school knew they stayed at a ski lodge that sounded like some kind of alpine palace, staffed by a regiment of liveried bellhops. People at Harvard, on the other hand, referred to their families' places in Vermont or New Hampshire as if these were cabins that their parents or grandparents had personally built log by log, and they seemed almost to compete about whose had the fewest amenities. We never have enough hot water because we rely on our own solar generator, totally off the grid. Amy spoke of the 5-star steakhouse her family ate at after a long day on the trails. Harvard people talked of standing outside in 0-degree weather, waiting for their charcoal grills to heat up, as if their families never bought into the whole indoor stove fad. Nate, too, had been skiing. With a group of kids from a synagogue, he spent a weekend on a barren mountain in Pennsylvania that was also home to an abandoned mine. The trip was called a Shabbaton. They stayed at a Holiday Inn and ate at the Denny's across the parking lot. Nate had never thought of himself as disadvantaged. His parents were immigrants, but the kind with good jobs. They worked for defense contractors. He grew up in a detached house with a lawn and a metal swing set in the back. He attended a private, albeit religious school, where he got an excellent education. His parents had graduate degrees. Master's in Engineering from Polytechnic University of Bucharest, rather than, say, PhDs in art history from Yale. But growing up, Nate had discussed current events at the dinner table. As a family, they watched 60 Minutes in Jeopardy. Apparently, though, some parents read the New York Review of Books and drank martinis. In time, Nate would learn to make finer distinctions between the homes of his most sophisticated classmates, the old-school WASPs versus the academic intellectuals, Jew or Gentile. But in the first weeks of college, it seemed to him that everyone, from the children of well-known leftist firebrands to the spawn of union-busting industrial titans, spoke the same language. It seemed that way because they did. When it came right down to it, these groups were like the Capulets and the Montagues. Whatever their differences, they were both wealthy Veronese families. Nate's family was from Romania. Before he arrived at Harvard, Nate had read War and Peace and Ulysses for his own edification. But more important, he had shown up without ever having heard of GA Press. So he couldn't mock it. Eventually he gleaned it was a clothing store. He had only a distant familiarity with the New Yorker and no idea how easily an apple can be converted into a device for smoking pot. Nate had been captain of his high school trivia team. He knew many things, for example, the capital of every African country, as well as each nation's colonial name, which he could reel off alphabetically. But he did not know the kinds of things that made a person knowing at Harvard in the fall of 1995. And you know what? I think I'm going to stop there and leave the rest of Nate's college years up in the air. So, as many conquests will be left to be imagined. Thanks. So I would be glad to take questions if anyone has any. Mary? Oh, first of all, thank you, Mary.
Could you talk a little bit about Nate's perception of
Mhm.
being my best friend? Like, why does he see her as like a love of her?
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question for everyone. So in the book, Nate has a few friends. One is this guy named Jason, who's kind of a jerk. He's kind of an asshole, a bigger asshole than Nate. And one is a guy named Peter, and another is a woman named Arit, who challenges him a lot. I like Arit a lot, I have to say. Arit gives Nate a hard time about his dating habits and how he treats women. And Mary's question was, why does Nate seem to respect Arit when he's kind of hard on other women? And I think the answer is twofold. The one, I think Arit is his friend, and that helps. She can give him a hard time about how he treats other women, but because she doesn't want to date him, it's an abstract thing, so it's fun. And Nate, he reacts badly when he perceives pressure from a woman to commit, and he perceives pressure a lot. He's quick to assume women are really into him. Not always, well, he's a confident guy, I guess, in his older years after he shed his dorky high school persona. So I think Arit, he can be more comfortable with Arit because she doesn't want anything from him in that sense. But in the other sense, I think that Nate is a very cerebral, analytical, and kind of verbal guy. He likes to argue with his male friends or spar with them, and Arit also enjoys that. She challenges Nate in ways that he enjoys, and he sort of feels comfortable and kind of like letting loose the self that he tends to reserve for his male friends, I think. And so I think he appreciates that about Arit, that argumentative quality and the fact that she does call him out on things. But also, too, as an author, I have to say, I put Arit in the book for somewhat a selfish purpose, too. There are things she says that I just wanted someone to say in the book. I wanted a challenge to Nate's point of view. And I find their friendship very plausible and believable. I hope it reads that way. I didn't want her to be this wise friend who just comes in and speaks the truth. I think she's got a point of view. She's not always right. I feel like she said some things that I wanted someone to say to Nate. Over there?
So I think in the book, one of my questions right off the bat was if you had met someone like this, or this had been off of somebody, like to childhood, and I heard that wasn't the case. And immediately the question afterwards, I'm going to just preface this by saying, in many ways, as much as Nate's admitted, I identify with Nate, like a lot of times. And I know it's a terrible thing to say, but it's like, I almost felt watched. I felt like you really nailed it, and I just felt like this was really masculine. And I really, and that's why my question was, I wonder if she's met someone because she met someone who had these qualities, because these are right on the point. And I heard that wasn't the case. Immediately I want to know, how do you get into someone's head without actually meeting them?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. That's a very generous thing. I'm going to repeat the question, but I also wanted to say thank you. That the question was twofold of is Nate based on a real person? And the questioner kindly said that I think generously and candidly said that he both related to Nate and that in ways that could be slightly uncomfortable. And I appreciate that. I've actually hear that a lot from guys. I want to assure you, you're not the only one. You're not so bad. Don't worry about it. And the fact that you see yourself in Nate, you're better than Nate. The fact that you sort of see this and cringe a little, like you're not like, oh, that's awesome. You know, like, so don't worry. You're like 10 times, 100 times better off than Nate. So, yeah, I guess I didn't model Nate to a T on any particular person. Like, there's no real life inspiration. There's parts of me in Nate. I don't think I said here, but Nate is from Baltimore. That's where I'm from. The kind of culture clash I was sort of trying to describe is of when he went to college is familiar to me. My mother is a Romanian immigrant, and Nate's parents are. There are aspects of my own history here. I did that in part because I felt like I had to work so hard to imagine all the male stuff, so I was trying to make it easier for myself in other ways to be like, okay, I'll just give Nate aspects of my own upbringing. So some of that, some of him is based on me, and some of the like psychological stuff that's inherently male. How I worked is I felt like I lived in the world a long time. I was 31 when I started writing this book, and I had dated various guys who were some of whom were more or less like Nate, and I had friends who dated various guys. I have 2 brothers. I have male friends. I felt like there were certain behaviors that seemed stereotypically male. A stated or like lack of interest in getting in relationships, or an ambivalence about that. Just a general wariness. Things like having a great date and then not calling the woman for a while after. I sort of felt like I knew the external manifestations of maleness, and I thought, I'm going to just try to imagine backwards. I'm going to imagine a rationale for why he might behave in these ways that, as a woman, aren't always necessarily totally intuitive to me. But he's not evil. He never is operating, he's never making a move because he wants to hurt someone, or he's just, I think Nate pisses off women for good reason, or, I mean, they're right to be pissed off, but he always has a justification for his actions. So I just tried to come up to, I knew the storyline, and I just tried to work backwards and think of it like, how might someone like Nate, who is smart, justify his behavior, because he's not, everybody has to sleep at night, and we don't go to bed at night thinking, God, I'm such an asshole, I'm so proud of myself, like, he has his reason. So that's how I operated, and in my mind, I tried to fact check it against, does this sound like how I can imagine a guy I know thinking? And honestly, there are aspects of men whom I love in Nate. I don't think, I have issues with him. I have a long critique, but I don't think he's all bad, or else I don't know. My poor brothers are kind of bad too. So, other questions? All right, Connor.
Is there any significance behind Daniel Craig as a
It's so funny. I literally cannot remember coming up with the name. It almost sounds like a lie when I say this, but it just was. I remember sitting at the park, I described in the class I spoke at today, sitting at the park when I got the original idea for this book. I remember that, but I don't remember where the name came from. But it's like Nate was always Nate, and I don't have any strong association with the name Nate, or I didn't beforehand. And it was Nathaniel P. I came up with Piven later, and I was literally like looking on, like, doing Google searches for Romanian last names that start with a P, because I don't know, it was the love affairs of Nathaniel P. So I just needed Piven. I already needed a name, and I found Piven. So, but yeah, I don't know. I think it's funny the things that seem to, I don't know, with a novel, there's some things you craft consciously, and other things which seem like they were just there. Like, I just woke up one day with the name, not necessarily the title. I always had this title for the book, The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P., but I didn't like it for a long time and kept trying to think of others. But apparently I'm really bad with titles. Like, I'd tell them to my ideas to my husband, and he wouldn't just say no. He'd just be like, oh. So I don't know. We never came up with anything better.
I think I spent a good deal of my time reading the book analyzing the male characters, and I kind of forgot to analyze the female characters. So I was wondering if you wrote the book kind of intending it to shed light on like female shortcomings in relationships as much as it wanted to shed light on the male characters.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is about the female characters in the book, and whether it's sort of intended to shed light on female relationship issues. And I think the answer is really yes. That I felt like I couldn't be fair to Nate and Nate's perspective without being hard on women, because part of Nate's rationale, his justification for his behaviors, is that women are the women he tends to see feel to him relationship obsessed, and they want more, like that. He's not acting in a vacuum. He's got these theories about women that are motivating him, and I didn't want his theories to be totally whack out there theories. I don't always agree with Nate's perception of the women in his life in particular, or his generalizations about women, but they were ones that felt plausible to me. Of two parts. There's some things he thinks about women in general and women's intellect, and he says things like that he thinks that women are as capable of rational thought as men, but they tend not to be as interested in it. They're more interested in the personal. I think that I felt like I have met intellectual men who I think don't state this publicly. They don't say this aloud, nor does Nate. These are Nate's private thoughts. He knows better than in a PC age to say this to people. But to me, this felt plausible as a kind of thought a guy like Nate might have. And the same is true, I think, for some of the ways he analyzes the particular women in his life. And I think all of Nate's analyses are plausible. He's not nuts, but they're also a little bit ungenerous. Like, he's very, very quick to assume women are relationship obsessed. And I felt at times in writing the book, I felt like I was betraying women, because Nate is harsh on the women, and I think he's sometimes convincingly harsh. But I felt like if I was going to write a book that men would read and relate to and feel that they saw their experience in, I couldn't make all the women these like angelic, wonderful people who are sort of perfect and perfectly appealing, and only Nate is flawed. I felt like it wouldn't serve my purposes. It wouldn't ring true to the like for Nate, it would have to feel like, oh, but this ex-girlfriend's crazy in that way, and this one's crazy in that way, and that's why I did this. But at times it felt kind of harsh, because my own point of view is so buried. It's like I'm so much more like some of the women than I'm like Nate. So it's all gets convoluted.
Did you by any chance, just curious, but in the whole writing process, did you by any chance like look up in like the men's websites or like a magazine like GQ or like Ask Men or anything, just to like get some like idea?
So the question is research and using men's websites or men's magazines. I feel I can really say anything in this library. It's really cool. All right. So, well, one thing I had to say, like some of the things my friends said to me over the years, or little things my husband might say or my brothers would say, stuck in my head because they feel like things I never would have thought of in 1,000 years as a woman. So, one of which was this friend of mine. My husband and I are both writers, and he goes to a writing space every day to work. Like, it's a shared office that he rents a space in, so he has just an office to go to. I just work at home. But so my friend, an old friend from high school, said to me, like, you know why Evan goes to the writing space, don't you? I was like, oh yeah, he likes to get out of the house. He feels better if he gets dressed and goes someplace every day. He doesn't like just being, he gets cabin fever at home. I was like, no. The reason he goes to the writing space is because if you were at home, you just look at porn too much. And I just thought, like, I never asked Evan if this was true, but it's in 1,000 years. I just feel like I have procrastination issues sometimes with work. That is not really one of, like, I don't know if that is true, but that was just this nugget. I was like, that's really good. I'm putting that in the book. And I make Nate think a thought similar, like a paraphrased version of going to a coffee shop helps his productivity. So there were things like that, literally I never would have thought of that. So just moments. I'm trying to think. I didn't particularly go to websites or magazines. And in part, I wanted to rely on something more intuitive, of that working backwards process of trying to come up with a rationale for what Nate did that seemed plausible. And then I thought I would test it. I'd give it to friends who were male and give it to men to read, and it could seem right. But I didn't want to be too influenced from before I wrote. I kind of felt like I just wanted to, I don't know, the kinds of things I wanted to really explore in terms of Nate's psychology were just things I didn't trust anyone else to do. Like, I wanted to come up with my own rationale and then see how it compared, or see how, if people thought it rang true or not.
I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your writing process, in particular revision.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm going to probably answer this in more depth than, I don't know how many people in here are writers or thinking about novel writing, but for those of you who are, I like answering this question in depth because it's somewhat a long story. I'm 37 now, and I started writing this book when I was 31. It took a while, and it was my second novel that I wrote. I always wanted to be a novelist, and it was what I wanted to do when I graduated from college. The problem was everything I wrote was not good, and even I could see that. So during my 20s, I worked as a journalist, which was great. It was a lot of fun, but I was always trying to write fiction on the side. And when I was 29, I actually wrote a novel. It was with a beginning, a middle, and the end. It was like, that was 10 times farther than I'd ever gotten with any of my previous attempts. So I was thrilled. But then I wasn't able to find a publisher for it, which at the time was a very devastating experience, because I was just so thrilled to have finished a novel that I just thought that soon I was going to be rich and famous, and I'd never have to have a day job again. I just thought, a whole set of things. And I think what I did is I confused the euphoria of finishing a novel with the considered sense of whether the novel was good. And I think that novel had a lot of problems. And I tried really hard to avoid that with this novel by spending so much time and doing a lot of revising. It took me about 2.5 years to write the first draft, and it took me almost as long to revise and to realize that just because when you're too close to something, sometimes you don't actually read, or I didn't read the words on the page. I read the words I wanted to be on the page, and I knew the story so well, so in a way the process of revising was making the actual book closer to what I always thought it was in my head. But and then it was really hard in a lot of ways. It was hard psychologically. I learned a lot because there were just moments where I so wanted to be done. I was in my 30s. By this point, in order to spend time on the novel, I wasn't able to work full-time as a journalist. It didn't work. I was working as an SAT tutor, which is a great side job to earn some money to write a novel, but it wasn't like this satisfying career. And I was getting older, so in my 30s, so I really wanted to be done with this novel. But I felt like, okay, I'd made this mistake with the first novel of rushing it, and I'm going to do the work here, even if it's really hard, even if it means if I have some anxiety in my mind, like, oh, maybe the pacing isn't great here, there's this temptation to push that anxiety away and just be like, no, it's fine. but I felt like, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm gonna kind of pay attention, and even if that means more time and more work, I just want to make this as strong as it possibly could be. And what it also meant was the input of others. And I gave the novel to a number of friends when I was writing it, and then when I finished, I got a literary agent who also had editorial comments, and that was really, really crucial. It's really hard. My agent, she gave me back that, like, she'd read the novel, she said she loved it, she signed me on as a client. I was like, this is great. And she's like, yeah, I've got some suggestions. She gives me back this manuscript. I get home and she's like, I have these red lines down whole pages that I've labored over, and it was for like 2 days I was in shock, and there were many tears shed. It felt like, not to be too histrionic, but it just feels like brutal to see these words that you care about so much and this red line through them. But I realized some of her thoughts were really smart, so that made me, and I couldn't discount any of her suggestions immediately. I didn't take them all. Sometimes I thought her red lines were wrong, and I thought she was wrong and I was right. But because she had some really smart ideas, I realized I have to pay attention to each of them. I have to really consider them, even if it seems really hard and hostile. It turned out to be the best thing in the world. I felt like, for me, the process of revising was learning to put this ego aside, like ego and the desire to rush to the end, to just be like, to get to the next step that hopefully would involve money and glory and be more fun than working as an SAT tutor and worrying about money in a different way. So that was interesting to me, because it just wasn't something I knew till I did it, and now I'm the world's biggest champion for revising, and just to me it was so important to learn that. Anything else?
How do you pick friends that you trust?
Right, I think that's such a great question. So the question is, how do I pick the friends and trust the book with? I love this question because when I look back, I feel like I was so lucky in ways I didn't know. When I was writing the book, and I gave the book chapter by chapter to 3 people, one of whom is the one who's now my husband, but at the time he was just my boyfriend. And then there were 2 friends. One was a guy who's like a little bit Nate-like in his dating habits, but a good friend. I think Nate is also a good friend, just like Nate in that sense. And another is a woman friend. And when I look back, I realized that they gave me exactly what I needed at the time, which was enthusiasm. I had already written this novel that I couldn't get published, and I was really devastated by that, and I didn't, I didn't have a literary agent, I hadn't published any short stories. I didn't have that much reason to feel confident, and I think when I was writing the first draft of the book, what I really needed was what I got. It wasn't lots of criticism then. It was people who just seemed to enjoy it and say, can't wait for the next chapter, I want to know what happens next. And they might do some light line edits. Like, my husband Evan is a wonderful editor. I've been so grateful to him, but I think what mattered most in that first read was enthusiasm for me. But then, once it got to the part where I had a draft and I really wanted to make it better, I had a whole different set of needs from what I wanted with people. Then it was like, okay, I want to give it to people who I think are smart, whose opinions I value, and who will tell me the hard truth. And in some cases they were the same people, but it's like, now I'm ready for the real thing. And I think that was something very important for me to learn, that you might want different things at different times. That it's okay, I think, to need some confidence boosting early on, and I guess sometimes I wonder, your fiction workshops that can sound so brutal from the beginning, and I feel like that would have been really hard for me. I needed the harsh stuff later, and I guess everybody's different, and then the other thing too is that even people who are really smart, let's say my literary agent, I learned some of her edits were great. Others I really didn't take. I think ultimately you have to trust yourself that I think, to me, what I learned is to take everyone's suggestions really seriously and consider where they're coming from, even if at first they seem very alien and hard to hear, but not to accept them all. That ultimately, once you've considered them really fairly, it's it's your project and you have to make the final call. So at least my agent, there was just a particular chapter of the book that she wanted to cut. She thought it was too much backstory. She wanted to cut it in its entirety. And she and I joke about this now. I sort of adore her. At the time I was like, oh, that's crazy. But because she was so smart about other things, I thought about it. But now I think it's funny. She's got a point. It does cut from the forward momentum. On the other hand, I have to say that Jonathan Franzen wrote me a nice email, and he said that chapter was his favorite. It goes both ways. There's the, like, she had a point, and there's pros and cons to that chapter, and ultimately certain things are a judgment call. So, over here
I
again.
apologize for asking.
No, it's great.
But, about that editing process, it's a big deal to me. It's something that's very hard, I think, for anyone who
Mhm.
writes. And I've heard someone say before that one of the best things you can do is to sort of estrange yourself from your own work and look at it as if it wasn't yours, so
Yes.
that you can edit it and make it be what you really have to be up here. So I was going to ask, do you have any strategies about those 2.5 years that you might have come up with to
Mhm.
sort of jump into that mode where you can estrange yourself from your work?
Totally. I do have suggestions. So it's sort of how do you get that dispassionate mindset where you can read your work and try to be objective, and I would say one is just a simple thing of time, that to finish and then put it away for a bit and try to come back at it later when you're just not exactly the same person as you were when you wrote it. And that can be as little as a week or as much as a couple of months, but to see what makes sense. Like, in some ways, the more time, the better, but it depends. Sometimes you're rushing for a lot of reasons: deadlines, class schedules, your desire to try and publish a book because you're getting older. So I don't mean you can always have endless amounts of time, but I think time helps. But then on a more practical level, I have to say what I did. I started printing out sections of the book, of my book, before it was even a book. Like, it was still as a Word document. If I were going over a chapter, I would copy it and paste it in a new document and change the margins and the font, and that helped a lot. Like, I was so used to looking at it the same way that just having it look different on the page would be really helpful. The other thing I did too is I'd take a chapter and I would read it 3 times in a row at later phases of revision. Until I wanted to die. I was so sick of it. But I found that once I read it 3 times in a row with a pen, I could see things. It would take me 3 times to be like, oh, you know what? Like, a sensory detail would really help round out this thing, or this sentence is repetitive. Like, it'd be small things, but I felt like it ultimately made it better. So it was just repetitive reading, like becoming immersed in it. I know I sound insane and obsessive, and I am. So.
Do you mean reading it aloud?
I would read mostly to myself. I try to read a lot in my head, the way you can do, and every once in a while I'd read a paragraph aloud. I sort of support people who read a lot. I didn't that much, and I always sort of imagined if the book was published and there was an audio book, I sort of thought I would get to sit there in the studio and listen to the person read it and make last-minute changes when I heard a good reader read it. It didn't turn out that way. I had nothing to do with the audiobook guy, and I've never listened to the audiobook, but I've heard people have said he's made mistakes. Like, there's a major street in New York that's everyone knows is Houston Street, but the audiobook was recorded in Michigan, and he called it Houston Street. So people tell me, or they say so on Twitter. It just turned out had nothing to do with me. The rights were sold and some other company made it. But I thought that would be great if I could just sit and listen to someone read it and make last minute changes. But I feel like was there someone back there? Great.
For your first novel, how or when did you decide to think about the story from something new?
Yeah, okay. So the question is the first novel, my novel that didn't get published, what happened with that? So I finished it in this state of great euphoria, and I have to say, in fairness to my younger self, it wasn't a disaster. It was a real novel with a story that I can see why I was excited to finish it, and there were things about it to recommend it. So I sent it to agents, and my first inclination that maybe it wasn't as good as I hoped. is that I'd lived in New York a while, so I had some vague, tenuous connections to literary agents, but they're very small connections, I should say, at that point. I just worked as a journalist, so I maybe knew some writers who knew some agent. I had a list of like 10 literary agents that I sent that book to, and I sort of quickly either heard back from ones who said no, or they wanted very significant revisions, or didn't respond again. Like, I knew the response I was getting, that they were actually reading the novel, but they weren't responding with the great enthusiasm I hoped. Except for one. So, and the one agent who was interested in the book, as it was the least experienced literary agent. She was a real legitimate agent who made a living in it, but she mostly did like Idiot's Guide to whatever books, and she wanted to move into more literary fiction, so she was happy to take on my book, but she literally hadn't sold one. She sold some maybe mystery novels. And that should have been a sign that none of the more experienced agents were interested. The best other response I got was, if you do serious revisions, I'd look at it again in a year. But I was so glad that someone said yes. I was like, okay, well, she sees what a jewel it is. So she did send it. So I signed with this literary agent, and how this works is a literary agent then sends it to publishers. And then she sent it to publishers. And I knew that it wasn't going to be published when they all said no. But it's easy for me to say that now. It happened slowly over a year. It was so miserable because they didn't respond right away. So I kept holding out hope. Like, oh, all I need is someone to say yes. It really took about a year before each editor had responded saying, no, we don't think this is all the way there. It's not going to work. So it was a long, slow year that it was slowly dawning on me that it wasn't going to go super smoothly. And I was really, I don't know how else to put it, I was just very depressed that year. I felt like I cared so much about the book. I thought it was really good, and it was so much better than anything else I'd written. And I felt like I'd gambled a lot on it for ways it would be too long of a story to tell, and that I had left a job that I didn't really like to spend a few months writing that novel, and then when it didn't work out, it felt very embarrassing socially and personally. And I started this working as an SAT tutor because I thought, oh, it'll just be for a couple months until the novel sells and I'm rich and famous. And then I kept working as an SAT tutor, which just wasn't super gratifying. So it was like a long, dark year. And then I slowly started writing again, but I started writing journalism more, and I started writing freelance book reviews. And it was like dipping my toe back in a little bit to feel, to write something and get a little, like to just feel like I was doing something out there in the world. And so it was like another year of kind of recovering and feeling better of writing journalism while I kind of was getting ready to start this novel. And so it really took 2 years from finishing that first novel to starting the second one. And Evan, who's now my husband, I really am so grateful to him for, we started dating somewhere in those 2 years, and at a certain point he was like, you have to stop talking about the tragedy of your novel that didn't get published. Like, you have to move on. It didn't get published. Start a new one. And he was right. I needed to hear that to move on. And then the irony is that what I'd say now is, wow, that's the best thing that ever happened to me, is that novel that didn't get published. Because now I look back at it with fondness, but it wasn't ready. And I feel like I learned a lot from it, but I'm so glad that wasn't my first published novel. But I would have been shocked to hear myself say this when at the time when I was so devastated.
Do you have any plans to revitalize that first novel?
Yeah, interesting question about whether I'd go back to that first novel. And I've thought of it, and people have asked me about it, especially some of my friends and my family who read it and were fond of it, and I feel like I'm touched by that. I, too, for a long time, thought that I would go back to that novel. And then I read it. I hadn't read it for years, but I read it maybe 3 years ago. And what I expected to find when I read it was that, oh, the writing wasn't great, but the story was totally in place and the characters were in place. What I found instead is that the writing was fine. It wasn't the best. Yeah, it was fine. Not great, but fine. But the characters seemed to me sort of immature for my. When I look back on them, I felt like there were two characters that were women who I related to a lot, and they looked like they were stand-ins for me that I was using to justify myself, and everything about them was wonderful, and everyone else loved them. And then characters I didn't like so much, I was unfair to. Like, I was too close to it, and I think I was using it to do. I didn't know this consciously, but sort of a self-justification. So when I read it, I was like, these are actually bigger problems, because I kind of think some of they're not bad characters, but the characters I like less, I don't think it was fair to them, and actually, I don't think they would actually do what I have them do in the story. And then if they don't do that, then it doesn't spur this to happen, and the plot falls apart. So I kind of felt like I can't fix the problems without undermining the whole story, if that makes sense. And that was a surprising realization. I just feel like I think at this point it would be so hard to fix that I might as well just start a new novel that I'm more interested in now. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you so much, Ren.